Hello, this is the Manchurian General, and today we're going to be reading Ammianus Marcellinus' Roman Antiquities. More specifically, we're going to be reading book 31. And even more specifically on that, we're going to be reading chapters 1 through 4. Because there's 16 chapters, and if we try to read all 16 chapters, this video will take hours to do. So we're only going to do chapters 1 through 4 today, and I will post the other parts in following succession, at least for the most part. Let's begin with book 31, chapter 1. And also, one more quick note. I will link below in the description the site I am using for the translation of Roman Antiquities, or the Lacus Curtius. I will be linking it down below, so either you can read along or you can just read yourself on your own time. But yep, here we go. Chapter 1. Omens of the death of Valens Augustus and of the impending defeat by the Goths. Meanwhile, Fortune's rapid wheel, which is always interchanging adversity and prosperity, armed Bologna in the company of her attendant furies and transferred to the Orient melancholy events, the coming of which was foreshadowed by the clear testimony of omens of importance. For after many true predictions of seers and augurs, dogs leapt back when wolves howled. Night birds rang out a kind of doleful lament. The sun rose in gloom and dimmed the clear morning light. At Antioch, in quarrels and riots of the common people, it became usual that whoever thought that he was suffering wrong shouted without restraint, "Let Valens be burned alive." And the words of public cries were continually heard, directing the people to gather firewood to set fire to the bath of Valens, in the building of which the emperor himself had taken such interest. All this almost in plain speech showed that this kind of death threatened him. Furthermore, the ghostly form of the king of Armenia and the piteous shades of those who shortly before had executed in connection with the fall of Theodorus, shrieking horrible songs at night. In the form of dirges, tormented many with dire terrors. A heifer was found lying lifeless with its windpipe cut, and its death was an indication of great and widespread sorrow from funerals of the people. Finally, when the old walls of Chalcedon were torn down, in order that a bath might be built at Constantinople, and the rows of stone were taken apart, there was found on a square block hidden in the midst of the structure of the wall an inscription containing the following Greek verses, clearly revealing what was to happen. When gaily through the city's festival streets shall whirl soft maidens in a happy dance. When mournfully a wall shall guard a bath, then countless hordes of men spread far and wide, with warlike arms shall cross clear Istrus' stream, to ravage Scythia's field and Mysia's land. But mad with hope, when they prayed, Pannonia there was their battle, and life's end their course shall check. Chapter 2. Of the houses and customs of the Huns, the Hellani, and other nations of Asiatic Scythia. However, the seed and origin of all the ruin and various disasters that the wrath of Mars aroused, putting in turmoil all places with unwanted fires, we have found to be this: the people of the Huns, but little known from ancient records, dwelling beyond the Maiolic Sea near this ice-bound ocean, exceed every degree of savagery, since there the cheeks of the children are deeply furrowed with the steel from their very birth, in order that the growth of hair, when it appears at the proper time, may be checked by the wrinkled scars. They grow old, without beards and without any beauty. Like eunuchs, they all have compact, strong limbs and thick necks, and are so monstrously ugly and misshapen that one might take them for two-legged beasts, or for the stumps rough-hewed into images that are used in putting sides to bridges. But although they have the form of men, however ugly, they are so hardy in their mode of life that they have no need of fire nor of savory food, but eat the roots of wild plants and the half-raw flesh of any kind of animal, whatever which they put between their thighs and the backs of their horses, and thus warm it a little. They are never protected by any buildings, but they avoid these like tombs, which are set apart from everyday use. For none, even a hut thatched with reed, can be found among them, but roaming at large amid the mountains and woods. They learn from the cradle to endure cold, hunger, and thirst. When away from their homes, they never enter a home unless compelled by extreme necessity, for they think they are not safe when staying under a roof. They dress in linen cloth or in the skins of field mice sewn together, and they wear the same clothing indoors and out. But when they have once put their necks into the faded tunic, it is not taken off or changed until by long wear and tear it has been reduced to rags and fallen from them bit by bit. They cover their heads with round caps and protect their hairy legs with goat skins. Their shoes are formed upon no last, and so prevent their walking with free step. For this reason, they are not at all adapted to battles on foot, but they are almost glued to their horses, which are hardy. It is true, but ugly, and sometimes they sat on them, woman fashion, and thus perform their ordinary task. From their horses, by night or day, every one of that nation buys and sells, eats and drinks, and bowed over the narrow neck of the animal, relaxes into a sleep so deep as to be accompanied by many dreams. And when deliberation is called for about weighty matters, they all consult as a common body in that fashion. They are subject to no royal restraint, but they are content with the disorderly government of their important men, and led by them, they force their way through every obstacle. They also sometimes fight when provoked, and then they enter the battle drawn up in wedge-shaped masses, while their medley of voices makes a savage noise. And as they are lightly equipped for swift motion and unexpected in action, they purposely divide suddenly into scattered bands and attack, rushing about in disorder here and there, dealing terrific slaughter. And because of their extraordinary rapidity of movement, they are never seen to attack a rampart or pillage an enemy camp. And on this account, you would not hesitate to call them the most terrible of all warriors, because they fight from a distance with missiles having sharp bone instead of their usual points, joined to the shafts with wonderful skill. Then they gallop over the intervening spaces and fight hand to hand with swords, regardless of their own lives, and while the enemy are guarding against wounds from the saber thrust. They throw strips of cloth plaited into nooses over their opponents, and to entangle them that they fetter their limbs and take from them the power of riding or walking. No one in their country ever plows a field or touches a plow handle. They are all without fixed abode, without hearth or law or settled mode of life, and keep roaming from place to place like fugitives, accompanied by the wagons in which they live. In wagons their wives weave for them their hideous garments. In wagons they cohabit with their husbands, bear children, and rear them to the age of purity. None of their offspring, when asked, can tell you where he comes from, since he was conceived in one place, born far from there, and brought up still farther away. In truces they are faithless and unreliable, strongly inclined to sway to the motion of every breeze of new hope that presents itself, and sacrificing every feeling to the mad impulse of the moment. Like unreasoning beasts, they are utterly ignorant of the difference between right and wrong. They are deceitful and ambiguous in speech, never bound by any reverence for religion or for superstition. They burn with an infinite thirst for gold, and they are so fickle and prone to anger that they often quarrel with their allies without provocation, more than once on the same day, and make friends with them again without a mediator. This race of untamed men, without encumbrance, aflame with an inhuman desire for plundering others' property, made their violent way amid the rapine and slaughter of the neighboring peoples, as far as the Helani, once known as the Massagetae, And since we have come to this point, it is in place to tell of the origins and dwelling place of this people also, and to point out the confused opinions of geographers who, after many attempts to deal with the subject, have at last come upon the core of the matter. The Hister, filled to overflowing by a great number of tributaries, flow past the Sarmatians, and these extend as far as the river Tanais, which separates Asia from Europe. On the other side of this river, the Hoani, so called from the mountain range of the same name, inhabit the measureless wastes of Scythia, and by repeated victories they gradually wore down the peoples whom they met, and like the Persians incorporated them under their own national name. Among these, the Nervii inhabit the interior of the country near the lofty precipitous peaks nipped by the north winds and benumbed with ice and snow. Behind these are the Vidini and the Goloni, exceedingly savage races who strip the skins from their slain enemies to make clothing for themselves and coverings for their horses in war. On the frontiers of the Goloni are the Argothasi, who checker their bodies and dye their hair with a blue color, the common people with a few small marks, but the nobles with more and broader spots of dye. Beyond these are the Melancone and the Anthropophagi, who, according to report, lead a nomadic life and feed upon human flesh. And because of this abominable food, they are left to themselves, and all their former neighbors have moved to distant parts of the earth. And so the entire northeastern tract, until one comes to the Ceres, has become uninhabitable. In another part of the country, near the abodes of the Amazons, the Hoani mount to the eastward, divided into populous and extensive nations. These reach as far as Asia, and as I have heard, stretch all the way to the river Ganges, which flows through the territories of India and empties into the Southern Ocean. Thus the Hoani, who various people it is unnecessary now to enumerate, are divided between the two parts of the earth, but although widely separated from each other and roaming over vast tracts as nomads do, yet in the course of time they have united under one name, and are for short all called Hoani, because of the similarities in their customs, their savage mode of life, and their weapons. For they have no huts and care nothing for using the plowshare, but they live upon flesh and an abundance of milk, and dwell in wagons, which they cover with rounded canopies of bark, and drive over the boundless waste. And when they come to a place rich in grass, they place their carts in the center and feed like wild beasts. As soon as the fodder is used up, they place their cities, as we might call them, on the wagons, and so conveyed them. In the wagons, the males have intercourse with the women. In the wagons, their babies are born and reared. Wagons form their permanent dwellings, and wherever they come, that place they look upon as their natural home, driving their plow cattle before them. They pasture them with their flocks, and they give particular attention to breeding horses. In that land, the fields are always green, and here and there are places set thick with fruit trees. Hence, wherever they go, they lack neither food for themselves nor fodder for their cattle. Because of the moist soil and the numerous courses of rivers that flow hard by them, therefore all those who through age or sex are unfit for war remain close by the wagons and are occupied in light task. But the young men grow up in the habit of riding from their earliest boyhood and regard it as contemptible to go on foot, and by various forms of training they are all skilled warriors. From the same causes the Persians also, who are Scythians by origin, are highly expert in fighting. Moreover, almost all the Hoani are tall and handsome. Their hair inclines to blonde. By the ferocity of their glance they inspire dread. Subdued though it is, they are light and active in their use of arms. In all respects they are somewhat like the Huns, but in their manner of life and their habits they are less savage, and their plundering and hunting expeditions they roam here and there as far as the Maiolic Sea and the Cimmerian Bosporus, and also to Armenia and Medea. Just as quiet and peaceful men find pleasure in rest, so the Holani delight in danger and warfare. There, the man is judged happy who has sacrificed his life in battle, while those who grow old and depart from the world by a natural death they assail with bitter reproaches as degenerate and cowardly, and there is nothing in which they take more pride than in killing any man whatever. As glorious spoils of the slain they tear off their heads, then strip them of their skins, and hang them from their war horses as trappings. No temple or sacred place is to be seen in their country. Not even a thatched hut with straws can be discerned anywhere, but after the manner of barbarians, a naked sword is fixed in the ground, and reverently worship it as their god of war, the presiding deity of those lands over which they range. They have a remarkable way of divining the future, for they gather very straight twigs of osier and sort them out at an appointed time with certain secret incantations, and thus clearly learn what impends. They do not know the meaning of slavery, since all are born of noble blood, and moreover they choose as chiefs those men who are conspicuous for long experience as warriors. But let us return to what remains of our chosen subject. Chapter 3. The Huns compelled the Holani on the Tanais to join them either by force of arms or by treaties. They invade the Goths and drive them from their homes. The Huns, then having overrun the territories of the Holani bordering on the Gruthungi, to whom usage has given the surnames Tanaites, killed and plundered many of them, and joined the survivors to themselves in a treaty of alliance. Then in company with these they made the more boldly a sudden inroad into extensive and rich cantons of Hermenricus, a most warlike monarch, dreaded by the neighboring nations because of his many and varied deeds of valor. He was struck with consternation at the violence of this sudden storm. For a long time he did his best to maintain a firm and continued stand, but since rumor gave wide currency to and exaggerated the horrors of the impending danger, he put an end to his fear of these great perils by voluntary death. After his demise, Vathymarus was made king, and resisted the Holani for a time, relying on other Huns, whom he had paid to take his side. But after many defeats which he sustained, he was overcome by force of arms and died in battle. In the name of his little son Videricus, the management of affairs was undertaken by Alatheus and Saphrax, experienced generals known for their courage, but since the stress of circumstances compelled them to abandon confidence in resistance, they cautiously retreated until they came to the River Dynastius, which flowed through the wide extent of plain between the Hister and the Borysthenes. On learning of these unexpected events, Athenaricus, the chief of the Thurungi, against whom, as has been told before, because of aid which he has sent to Procopius, Valens had recently taken the field, attempted to stand his ground, and if he too should be attacked like the rest, was ready to put forth all his strength. Accordingly, he established his camp near the banks of the Dynastius, conveniently at some distance from the stockade of the Garunthi, and sent Mundaricus, afterwards in charge of the frontier throughout Arabia, with Lagarimanus and some other men of high rank, to the distance of 20 miles in advance to observe the advance of the enemy, while he himself, in the meantime, disturbed by no one, was preparing his army for battle. But the result was far other than he expected, for the Huns, who are shrewd in arriving at conclusions, suspecting that there was some larger force farther off, disregard the troops which they have seen, and who have disposed themselves to rest, as there was nothing to disturb them. Then, when the moon broke into darkness of night, they chose what seemed to be the best course, crossed the river by the ford, and fearing lest some informer should get ahead of them and frighten off the enemy who were at a distance, they made a swift attack on Ammianus himself. As he was stunned by their first onset, they forced him to take a speedy refuge in the steep mountains after losing a few of their own men. Ammianus, troubled by this unexpected attack and still more through fear of what might come, had built walls high, skirting the lands of the Tifoli from the banks of the river Garassus as far as the Danube, thinking that by this hastily but diligently constructed barrier, the security and safety will be assured. But while this well-planned work was being pushed on, the Huns swiftly fell upon him, and would have crushed him at once on their arrival had they not been so loaded down with booty that they gave up the attempt. Yet, when the report spread widely among the other Gothic peoples that a race of men, hitherto unknown, had now arisen from a hidden nook of the earth, like a tempest of snows from the high mountains, and was seizing or destroying everything in its way, the greater part of the people, who, worn out by lack of necessities of life, had deserted Ammianus, looked for a home removed from all knowledge of the savages, and after long deliberation what abode to choose, they thought that Thrace offered them a convenient refuge. For two reasons, both because it had a very fertile soil, and because it is separated by the mighty flood of the Hister from the fields that were already exposed to the thunderbolts of a foreign war, and the rest of the nation, as if with one mind, agreed to this plan. The greater part of the so-called Thuringian Goths, driven from their land, are transported to Thrace by the Romans with Valen's consent, after promising obedience and help in war. The Geronthi also, another division of the Goths, secretly crossed the Hister on rafts. Therefore, under the lead of Avitus, they took possession of the banks of the Danube, and sending envoys to Valens with humble entreaty, begged to be received, promising that they would not only lead a peaceful life, but would also furnish auxiliaries if circumstances required. While this was happening in foreign parts, terrifying rumors spread abroad that the peoples of the north were stirring up new and uncommonly great commotions, that throughout the entire region, which extends from the Marcomanni and the Quadi to the Pontus, a savage horde of unknown peoples, driven from their abodes by sudden violence, were roving about the river Hister in scattered bands with their families. In the very beginning, this news was viewed with contempt by our people, because wars in those districts were not ordinarily heard of by those living at a distance until they were ended or at least quieted for a while. But when the belief in what had taken place gained strength and was confirmed by the comings of the foreign envoys who begged with prayer and protestations that of an exiled race might be received on our side of the river, the affair caused more joy than fear, and experienced flatterers immoderately praised the good fortunes of the prince, which unexpectedly brought him so many young recruits from the ends of the earth, that by the union of his own and foreign forces he would have an invincible army. Also that instead of the levy of soldiers which have contributed annually by each province, there would accrue to the treasuries a vast amount of gold. In this expectation, various officials were sent with vehicles to transport the savage horde, and diligent care was taken that no future destroyer of the Roman state should be left behind, even if he were smited by a fatal disease. Accordingly, having by the emperor's permission to obtain the privilege of crossing the Danube, and settling in parts of Thrace, they were ferried over for some nights and days, embarked by companies in boats and on rafts, in hollowed-out tree trunks. And because the river is by far the most dangerous of all, and was then swollen by frequent rains, some who, because of the great crowd, struggled against the force of the waves and tried to swim, were drowned, and they were a good many. With such stormy eagerness on the part of the insistent men was the ruin of the Roman world brought in. This at any rate is neither obscure nor uncertain, that the ill-omened officials who ferried the barbarian hordes often tried to reckon their number, but gave up their vain attempt, as the most distinguished of poets says, "Who wishes to know this would wish to know how many grains of sand on the Libyan plain by Cephius are swept." Well then, let the old tales revive of bringing the Medic hordes to Greece. For while they described the bridging of the Hellespont, the quest of a sea at the foot of Mount Athos by a kind of mechanical severing, and the numbering of the armies by squadrons at Doriscus, later times have unanimously regarded all this as fabulous reading. For after the countless swarms of nations were poured through the provinces, spreading over a great extent of plain and filling all the regions and every mountain height, by this new evidence the trustworthiness also of old stories was confirmed. First Fritigern and Alavivis were received, and the emperor gave orders that they should be given food for their present needs and fields to cultivate. During this time, when the barriers of our frontier were unlocked and the realm of savagery was spreading far and wide, columns of armed men like glowing ashes from Aetna, when our difficulties and imminent dangers called for military reformers who were most distinguished for the fame of their exploits, then it was as if at the choice of some adverse deity, that men were gathered together and given command of armies who bore stained reputations. At their head were two rivals in recklessness. One was Lupercinus, commanding general in Thrace; the other, Maximus, a pernicious leader. Their treacherous greed was the source of all our evils. I say nothing of other crimes which these two men, or at least others with their permission, with the worst of motives, committed against the foreign newcomers, who were as yet blameless, but one melancholy and unheard of act shall be mentioned, of which, even if they were their own judges of their own case, they could not be acquitted by any excuse. When the barbarians after their crossing were harassed by lack of food, those most hateful generals devised a disgraceful traffic. They exchanged every dog that their instability could gather far and wide for one slave each, and among these were carried off also the sons of chieftains. During these days also, Vithericus, king of the Gruthungi, accompanied by Alatheus and Saphrax, by whose will he was ruled, and also by Pharnobius, coming near to the banks of the Danube, hastily sent envoys and besought the emperor that he might be received with like kindness. When these envoys were rejected, as the interests of the state seemed to demand, and were in doubt what course to take, Athenarchus, fearing a like fate, departed, remembering that he had some time before treated Valens with contempt when they were making a treaty of friendship, declaring that he was prevented by conscientious scruples from ever setting foot on Roman soil, and by this excuse he had forced the emperor to conclude peace in the middle of the river. Fearing that the grudge caused by this still endured, Athenarchus withdrew with all his followers to Calcalanda, a place inaccessible because of high mountains and deep forests, from which he first drove out the Sarmatians. We have reached chapter 5. We will continue this book in another video. I thank you if you have reached this far, and I will also be sectioning this video off into parts for each chapter for your listening enjoyment. I thank you for listening this far, and if you wish to support me in future videos, comment down below, like the video, and if you want to, support me on Patreon from $1 a month for the lowest and $5 for the highest. I thank you all for getting this far and for supporting me. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.